Hello and welcome. I'm Jochen and we are really excited to welcome you to our next webinar, Getting Started with OSS Mobile Access.
Welcome, my name is Eduard and together with Jochen we'll explain to you what OSS is and when and how to use it.
You might have seen our first webinar where we gave an introduction of the Tapkey integration capabilities and the Tapkey Web API. Today we talk about a quite similar topic. We take a look at the new upcoming OSS Mobile Access Standard. Just like in the first webinar, I'll give you a high-level non-technical overview and then Edward will show you the details of the new interface. But let's get started right away. What is OSS and what is the role of Tapkey? The Open Security Standard OSS Association focuses on the development of open standards for physical access. Big names in the access industry are members of the OSS as well as Tapkey. In the past, the focus was on access cards, and today the so-called OSS-SO standard is used by many companies. SO is short for Standard Offline. For quite a while now, however, the OSS has also been working on extending the standard to mobile access. It is clear that a smartphone with its internet connectivity opens up completely new possibilities. Tapkey has many years of experience in the field of mobile access. We are an OSS member since 2020, and Tapkey is a driving force in the process of standardizing OSS Mobile Access. Today, we provide interfaces of the latest version of the upcoming standard to all interested partners. This new standard has the goal to make it easier for integrators by increasing interoperability and flexibility. OSS-MA basically consists of three parts, the so-called interfaces A, B, and C. Interface A defines the web service interface between the third-party solution and the mobile credential provider. Interface B describes the communication between the smartphone and the locking device, and interface C covers the firmware part of the locking device. In this webinar, we will talk about the interface A, the interface that allows your platform to communicate with the Tapkey cloud service by using this upcoming standard. I would like to point out some really nice and shiny features which are a great benefit to you when using Tapkey's interfaces. Intelligent revocation handling. Tapkey offers a secure, automated mechanism to revoke permissions, which means that administrators no longer have to manually deal with revocation lists. This reduces complexity and increases security at the same time. Automatic time synchronization. The right time on the locking device is critical for its safe operation. That's why Tapkey detects deviations and synchronizes the time if necessary, without any user interaction. We see this functionality as a basic requirement for a simple and secure access control system. Flexible schedules. Tapkey supports super flexible locking plans such as recurring access permissions or time-restricted access. Even time zones are easily handled via Tapkey. Simple white label option. Tapkey offers system integrators a white label keyring app. It's the perfect way to maintain a consistent brand experience. There are a large number of different Tapkey locking devices available that you can use out of the box with the new OSS-MA Interface A. Of course, we are working with well-known manufacturers to Tapkey enable their reader devices, and we showed a first showcase this year at the Light and Building Fair in Frankfurt with our partners PHG and Dome. And by the way, many of the Tapkey compatible locking devices you see here on the slide are available at the Tapkey online store. So access is managed via the OSS-MA compliant API, and the Tapkey Trust Service then ensures that the keys are delivered to the user. But what apps can be used to use these mobile keys? You have different possibilities. And the easiest way to use these keys is the Tapkey app. The standard Tapkey app is publicly available in the Google Play Store and the Apple App Store, and it can transport OSS-specific data payload to the locking devices. However, you can always start with the Tapkey app and switch to your own branded app at a later date. So many integrators and customers want to put their own brand in the foreground. They want to enrich their own solution with the magic unlock button. For this purpose, we offer the Mobile SDK. With the Mobile SDK, you can integrate the unlock functionality into your own branded solution and create an important everyday use case for your users. There is one important thing. If you want your own branded app, you need an integrator license agreement. If you need more information about this, please contact me. And last but not least, if you don't want to mess around with app development or have a tight roadmap, you can use our white label keyring app offerings. We can also offer this keyring app as a managed service for you. Just talk to us and we will make you a tailor-made offer. But enough about the high-level overview. I'll hand over to Eduard, who will show you the bits and bytes of the interface.
Thank you, Jochen, for your clear overview of the OSS standard and that I can focus on technical details now. Specifically, I'll be talking about interface A that deals with access management. As the interface specification is still a work in progress from the OSS side, I will not go too deep into the details of the interface itself and focus more on how to connect the OSS and Tapkey worlds so you get a smooth experience. Still, to understand why we are doing certain things the way we do them, it is important to understand the basic details of OSS interface A, and that is specifically the endpoints available, the entities, and the authorization process. When managing access via the OSS API, we'll be using four main endpoints: map identity, update credential, revocation list, and reader events. Map identity is the first and probably the most important endpoint to understand, because here we find the most fundamental difference between OSS Mobile Access and OSS Standard Offline, which deals with classical RFID transponders. First of all, it's important to understand that there's no single OSS Mobile Access app or any single app that's to be used within the Tapkey ecosystem, but virtually any app could be extended to receive OSS Mobile Access mobile credentials and offer access-related functionality. However, in OSS Mobile Access, as well as in OSS Standard Offline, credentials are managed based on their OSS credential ID, which is a simple ID with a length of 10 bytes. The credential ID, as such, is not related to any specific app, so we need to have a way of specifying which credential ID should be used by which user in the context of which app. This is where the map identity endpoint comes into play. Map identity is used to map an OSS credential ID to a certain user in the context of a certain app, or more precisely, in the context of a certain identity provider. Here we touch another important concept, the identity provider. So let me explain what that is. As I just mentioned, the Tapkey ecosystem, as well as OSS Mobile Access, can be used with virtually any number of apps. However, not every app works the same when it comes to authenticating and identifying their users. Apps might identify their users on a multitude of different types of identities, including their users' email addresses, telephone numbers, passport IDs, or custom types of identity tokens. Moreover, different apps will usually have different and independent ways of authenticating their users. When talking about the example of email addresses, then some apps might authenticate their users by sending them an email message, while others might rely on social identities like Facebook, Twitter, or Google. The functionality of identifying and authenticating a user is implemented in what is called an identity provider. Each identity provider has its own identity provider ID. While multiple apps could share a single identity provider, the common case is that each app has its own. Specifying a mobile credentials identity provider, therefore, usually means the same as specifying the app that a certain mobile credential should be used with. Any app can register its own identity provider within the Tapkey ecosystem. If you want, for example, a mobile credential to be used with the Tapkey app, use Tapkey as the identity provider ID. So to get back to map identity endpoint, this endpoint allows you to specify which mobile credential, specified by its credential ID, can be used within which app, specified by the identity provider ID, and by which user, specified by the identifier. In Tapkey terms, a credential ID will be mapped to what is called a contact in Tapkey ecosystem. To learn more about identity providers and contacts within the Tapkey ecosystem, please refer to our documentation site at developers.tapkey.io. An update credential request updates the access permissions of a certain credential in the context of a certain site. Each call to this endpoint updates all the access permissions of the given credential on the specified site. Access permissions can have all the properties known from OSS Standard offline, including a validity date, daytime schedules, and so on. I will cover more details of this endpoint in the demo part of this presentation. It is important to understand that the input parameters define all the access permissions for a certain site. This means that if you make an update credential request for one log, and later you make an update credential request for another log within the same site, this will also override the grants for the first log. Both of these logs need to be covered in a single request. This also means that revoking an access permissions from a credential is extremely easy. It is done by simply sending an update credential request for the affected site, not containing the access permission to be revoked. Tapkey will automatically trigger all the steps required to reliably revoke the access permission, including updating the affected logs revocation list. A separate call to the revocation list endpoint is not required. Talking about the revocation list, when you wish to revoke access of one or more certain credentials, you can do so by using this endpoint. All access permissions of all the credentials listed in the request will be revoked. Note that unblocking a previously revoked credential is done using the update credential request. Sending an updated revocation list via this request is not necessary. Automatic management of the revocation list is fully integrated into the update credential endpoint. Reader events. This endpoint returns all the access events related to OSS Mobile Access credentials within a specific owner account. All the endpoints are described in detail in the OSS API definition that can be found on our Tapkey OSS management portal. The Tapkey OSS management portal, which can be found at oss.tapkey.io, is the entry point for using Tapkey's OSS Mobile Access API. I would like to explain to you which configuration is needed to get going. First of all, Tapkey OSS management portal contains all the necessary information on how to get started, from basic questions and links to a fully fledged test UI with all the endpoint details, including your computed URL to start with. Please do not forget to select your owner account first to see the extended menu options. As you have probably noticed while I was describing the endpoints, there is a difference in how OSS and Tapkey define their objects, as well as how the management itself works. When mapping a new identity, or as I explained, create a new contact or smartphone user in Tapkey, you must define a credential ID. This is a byte array of length 10 and it uniquely identifies your user. Following values are identity and identity provider ID. Here, use the same values you would use for identifier and IP ID in Tapkey Web API when creating contact. On the other hand, when you want to refer to a log via the OSS Mobile Access API, this log is identified by its site ID and door ID. Tapkey identifies logs via what is called the bound log ID, which is a string in GUID format. Mappings between both can be managed in the Tapkey OSS management portal. In OSS, a site represents a place or building where a log or group of logs is installed. The door represents one specific log within a site. The combination of door ID and site ID must be unique within an owner account and must be mapped to one single bound log ID. I will show you how the mapping is done in the practical example later. I will not be talking about how the grants time restrictions are created, as this is very specific to OSS and can be seen in the documentation itself. I will briefly show you one example in the demo. What is important for you to know is that all the time restrictions defined within OSS API requests will be automatically translated to time restrictions within Tapkey, either valid from valid before combination or ICO string, and therefore there is no additional work required from your side. The OSS Mobile Access API is specified to use API keys for accessing the API resources. As Tapkey has been designed to use OAuth client credentials for server-to-server communication, we implemented a way of translating client credentials as specified in the OAuth 2 authorization framework and as provided by Tapkey into API keys as required by OSS. What you need to do is to create a client credentials client and assign it administrator role for the owner account you want to manage. From the provided client ID and client secret, a base 64 string is generated that can be used as part of the API key. You usually won't take care of the base 64 conversion and formulating the API key yourself, so the Tapkey OSS management portal offers an option to generate it on the website directly. It is important to note that client secret is a confidential value and should only be used within the server applications. As this value is encoded into the API key, the same applies for using the API key. Again, how exactly to generate an API key and how to use it will be described in a few moments. As managing access is always done within the context of an owner account in Tapkey, the same will apply for using the OSS API. For instance, if we want to map an identity, we need to specify the owner account this should be created in, or if we update the credential, the owner account to look for that credential, as they don't necessarily need to be unique within two different owner accounts. For this reason, the URL is constructed as https ossapi.tapkey.io API v1 tk/your owner account ID. This serves as a base URL for any OSS API requests. For instance, https ossapi.tapkey.io/API v1 tk my owner account ID/map identity. The URL to use is displayed on the Getting Started page or computed in the Open API page of Tapkey OSS Management Portal as well. Now, when you understand the basic concept of how to use OSS API within the Tapkey environment, let's have a look at the example of the usage. Let me prepare the video. I'm back in a few seconds. The example I'm going to show right now is publicly available on GitHub and can be used with your owner account if you follow the next steps. Tapkey OSS Demo displays a registration form to a user and based on the received information creates an OSS mobile credential with permission to access some pre-configured demo logs. Let's navigate to github.com/tapkey and from the repositories select the Tapkey OSS Fair Showcase. The reason for the name is that it has been implemented for a fair to present how the OSS API can be used together with logs. Once you download the repository and open the solution, you will see there are two projects in it. Tapkey.OSS API client takes the YAML specification of the OSS API and with external libraries converts them to a usable API client in .NET C#. Tapkey Fair OSS Showcase Web App, a Blazor server-side web application, is an actual registration form with all the access-related logic. The specific place where the access creation logic is happening is in folder data, class user service, and a method called register user. Upon receival of the user data, we will validate them and after that we generate a credential ID to be used with the OSS API. To cover the case when a user registered twice with the same email, we want to ensure that the credential ID is always the same, and that's why we generate it as the hash of the user email. Additionally, the credential ID is supposed to be displayed to the user on the screen. To make sure that this value is actually human readable, we shorten it and take only the first 4 bytes from 10 bytes array. Afterwards, we need to get the configuration of the logs. This is something that has been created specifically for this application and is basically a JSON object representing the OSS API base URL information together with the site and door ID combinations. With such JSON, you can specify multiple base URLs and for each of them information about the logs we should create access permissions for. For each of these OSS base URLs, we create an instance of OSS API client that has been pre-configured in the startup process and received via dependency injection. We set the correct base URL and we call map identity with the information of the user. If we look inside of the method, we see that the request is provided with the credential ID generated a few seconds ago. Our users will be using the Tapkey app for unlocking and therefore the value for the identity provider ID will be Tapkey. This information is received from the settings and the identifier will be the email address itself. Upon receival of the response, we check the response result. If the result was nothing to do, we know that the user is already registered and the mapping already exists. If the result was successful, we continue to update the credential. As a first step, the credential validity is calculated. Again, all can be specified via the settings. In the update credential method, we create a new request for each of the sites represented in the configuration. For each request, a schedule is created. Week bits is an 8 bits representation of the weekdays the grant should be valid in. Then, with the valid from and valid to, we define which time span of a day will be permitted. The result can be, for instance, every working day 9 to 5. As the next step, we specify the profiles for the log. Each profile has a door ID, ID of the schedule in the one-based array, being 1 as we only have one schedule. Toggle function we set to off for a standard unlock. Type is door, and unlock time will keep default. The request will additionally contain the credential ID, the calculated validity, and the site ID. Once we send the request, we check if the result has been successful. It might happen that we will receive a partial result. Using partial result, we want to avoid huge requests with many grants being created at once. All you need to do if you receive this code is to send the request again and again until you receive the result OK or an error. For instance, if you send a request with 500 profiles, every time 100 grants are created. The first time it is the first 100 runs. On the second call, it will automatically recognize already created ones and create second 100 runs, meaning calling the request five times will result in the result OK. Don't forget, we'll need to send update credential requests for every site in the configuration. You probably noticed that we didn't take care of authorization at all. The API key usage is handled in the OSS API HTTP message handler provided via the dependency injection. Here, we attach an API key to every request we make. And that's about it. When we are done, we provide a credential ID to the UI, and the user can start using his credential with the Tapkey app. If you want to run this project on your own, the only things you will need to do is to fork the repo, provide the settings, and run the code. If you open app settings.json, you will see the values that must be provided. Let's start with the fair title and set it to OSS Webinar. Now we need to provide the API key. As mentioned previously, you will need to create a client credentials client and generate the API key from its credentials. First, I'll show you my own account on my.tapkey.com. Here you see I have 2 logs available, and everyone who is registered should receive an access permission for both of them. Now let's move to integrate the portal, or portal.tapkey.io, where I will create a client credentials client that will manage this owner account. For those of you who are not familiar with this process, I recommend you to read our documentation on developers.tapkey.io or watch our previous webinar where I went deep into the details. I will create a client and give it all necessary scopes that are listed in the Tapkey OSS management portal and create a client. Now let's open the Tapkey OSS management portal on oss.tapkey.io. I'm already logged in. Select the correct owner account. And now I see the extended menu options. Right on the first page, there is some basic info how to get started, including the full list of the scopes that can be used. Here I can see the Swagger UI with the whole specification, and with that I can test these endpoints as well. In the API key menu, I can generate my own API key. I will enter the generated client credentials. Now I click Generate. We can also test that it will work correctly with this owner account, and if it's all right, let's copy it to our settings. Next setting we have is Identity Provider ID. We already explained that in this case it will be Tapkey. Now we need a configuration. First thing to do here is to map the logs I have already bound to doors. I'll navigate to Mappings and add a mapping for each of the logs. Let's say that one will be site 1 with door ID 1, and the second will be in site ID 2 with door ID 2. Now we need to write a JSON file with configuration for our program. As I want to speed things up, I have it already prepared. As OSS API base URL, I copied the calculated value for my own account from the Tapkey OSS management portal that is displayed here. Underneath, the 2 mapped doors are specified. Now back to settings. We will leave the validity empty, so the start date is relative, and set the validity duration to 3 days. So now it will be valid for the following 3 days. The week bits will be weekdays with the value of 31, valid from hour will be 9, and valid before hour will be 17. Rest of the settings is for additional functionality that we will skip for now, and we will set enabled to false in both of the cases. Now we should be ready to go. Let's run it. The page is running, and now we will fill in some random data and email edward+webinar@tapkey.com and hit register. I successfully registered, I see my shortened credential ID, and I'm supposed to have access to both of the logs. Let's have a look again at my.tapkey.com. We can see that the grants for edward+webinar@tapkey.com exist for both logs, and we are good to go. Now let's have a look in our app. Navigate to the key and try to open one of the logs. I believe this has been insightful for you and that now you have a basic understanding of how the OSS API works together with Tapkey. If you have any questions now is the right time to ask them in the chat. In a moment, Jochen and I will come back to answer them before concluding this webinar. See you in a minute.
Thank you, Eduard. That was really great listening to you, and it looks like it's a great interface.
We have received the feedback that the code was not really readable, and we are very sorry for these technical issues, but the uploaded video will be in much higher quality, and we will provide you with the link tomorrow morning via the email.
And now we come to the last section of this webinar, the Q&A session. We received some questions in the chat. One question I think was already answered by Gunnar Hoff, but Eduard, I think, will say some words to it.
So the question was if the OSS Mobile Access Standard is final. So the OSS is currently working on this standard, and we allow our partners to test and work with the standard with the current version. But please be aware that the interfaces make changes without prior notice, and they will most likely change in the final release version. But the current exact API as implemented is always available via the oss.tapkey.io.
There's another question. How much does it cost to use the interface A? Well, the interface A can be used without any additional costs. Of course, if you want to use the Tapkey app to unlock the doors, you need a suitable user package. If you want to use the magic unlock button integrated in your own app, then you need an integrator license agreement. Just contact us or me, and we will make you a tailor-made offer that you can integrate the Tapkey technology into your app.
Okay. Another question is it possible to use other authorization options than API key? So the OSS Mobile Access API is specified to use API key for accessing the API resources. Nevertheless, you are also allowed to use the access token received by login.tapkey.com with the Tapkey OSS Mobile Access API. So both options are available, API key and the bearer token. But so while API key is part of the OSS Mobile Access specification, the bearer tokens are specific to the Tapkey's implementation.
Okay, that's interesting. There's one more question. Do you offer some demo hardware where I can start implementing? Well, I mentioned this in the overview. You can use any Tapkey compatible hardware. The easiest way to get one is to look into our online store and just buy any Tapkey lock, and you just can use the interface. I think we covered all questions.
Looks like that.
Now, thank you very much for joining the webinar. There will be more webinars, of course, covering more topics about Tapkey app, integrating the Tapkey technology into apps. Stay tuned, and we hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.